I came home early on a Tuesday afternoon to find my front door glass completely shattered. Inside my own living room, my father was standing over my terrified 7-year-old daughter, screaming at her to give him the combination to my safe. Down the hall, I could hear my older sister violently ripping my bedroom apart, tearing through my drawers and smashing my belongings. I did not run in. I did not scream. I simply stepped back, locked the deadbolt from the outside, and dialed 911. My name is Rachel. I am 34 years old and I work as a high-end estate liquidator and antique appraiser. For years, my family treated me like a glorified junk peddler, blind to the quiet fortune I had built. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family that underestimated your worth. The day had started perfectly normal. I was evaluating a collection of 19th century European art for a client and finished my appraisal 2 hours ahead of schedule. I decided to head back to my house in the quiet suburbs to surprise my daughter Emma, who had just gotten home from school with her babysitter. Instead of a peaceful afternoon, I pulled into my driveway to a scene out of a nightmare. The babysitter's car was gone, which made my stomach drop instantly. I later found out my father had dismissed her at the door, claiming it was a family emergency. I walked up the porch steps and saw the heavy glass pane of my front door smashed inward. Shards of glass glittered across my hardwood entryway. My initial panic froze into absolute ice when I heard the voices inside. It was my father, Richard. His booming, arrogant voice echoed through my usually serene home. He was shouting, his tone laced with a manic desperation I had never heard before. "Tell me the numbers, Emma. Stop crying and tell me the numbers right now. I know your mother hides her cash in that metal box. Give me the code." I peered through the broken pane. My sweet, brilliant 7-year-old daughter was curled into a tight ball under the heavy oak dining table, sobbing uncontrollably. She had her arms wrapped defensively around her knees, her small shoulders shaking with every shout that tore from my father's throat. He was pacing in front of the table, his face red, completely ignoring her terror. From the back of the house, the sound of splintering wood and breaking porcelain echoed down the hallway. "Did you find it yet, Vanessa?" my father yelled over his shoulder. "I cannot find anything in this junk heap." The muffled, frantic voice of my sister Vanessa shouted back from the direction of my master bedroom. "She is hiding the deeds and the bank papers somewhere. Keep making the kid talk." My own father and sister had broken into my home to rob me, terrorizing my child in the process. A weaker person might have barged in, screaming and crying, begging them to stop. But a lifetime of dealing with Richard and Vanessa had taught me that showing emotion only gave them ammunition. They fed on chaos and control. I refused to give them either. I slowly pulled my hand back from the doorknob. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out my keys, slipped them into the deadbolt, and turned it with a quiet, decisive click, locking them inside. Then I pulled out my phone and dialed the police. "Yes, I need immediate assistance," I told the dispatcher, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "There is a burglary in progress at my address. The intruders broke the front glass. They are currently inside, threatening my young daughter and destroying my property. Please hurry." I stood on the front lawn, the cool afternoon breeze whipping around me, and waited. The wail of police sirens pierced the suburban quiet less than 4 minutes later. 3 patrol cars swerved into my driveway, their lights flashing blue and red against the facade of my house. Officers sprang from their vehicles, hands on their holsters. I calmly pointed to the shattered door and handed them my key. "My daughter is under the dining table," I instructed the lead officer. "The 2 intruders are my father and sister. They are tearing apart my bedroom right now." The officers moved in swiftly. I heard the sharp, commanding shouts of the police ordering everyone to the ground. I heard my father's blustering protests instantly shut down. "Do not you know who I am? I am a respected businessman. This is my daughter's house. It is a family misunderstanding. Get on the ground now. Sir, hands behind your back." The officer's voice brooked absolutely no argument. I walked through my front door just as they were hauling Richard and Vanessa up from the floor, their wrists bound in heavy metal cuffs. Vanessa's designer dress was covered in dust from my bedroom floor, her perfect blowout ruined. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer entitlement. "Rachel, tell them to take these off," Vanessa shrieked, struggling against the officer's grip. We just came to look for some documents. You cannot arrest your own family. I did not even look at her. I walked straight past them, knelt under the dining table, and pulled a trembling Emma into my arms. She buried her face in my shoulder, her tears soaking my blouse. I held her tight, murmuring that she was safe, that Mommy was here, and that the bad people were going away. You are going to regret this, Rachel. Richard spat out as an officer shoved him toward the door. I am your father. I gave you everything. You are ruining this family over nothing. I stood up, holding Emma's hand securely in mine. I looked at the man who had spent his life belittling me, and at the sister who had always been the golden child currently wearing handcuffs in my living room. You have no right to be doing this to us. Vanessa yelled, her face contorting with rage. You owe us this. Dad paid for your life. We are entitled to what is in this house. I stepped closer to her, my voice dropping to a low, lethal calm. Dad paid for nothing, Vanessa. He stole my college fund when I was 18 to buy your first Porsche. This house, the antiques you just smashed, the life I have built, I earned every single penny of it myself. You are just a failing boutique owner trying to steal from the sister you always called a failure. The police yanked them forward, marching them out the door and down the front steps. I watched from the shattered doorway as my father and sister were shoved into the back of the patrol cars, the doors slamming shut on their arrogant protests. After giving my statement to the officers and assuring them I would press full charges for breaking and entering, property damage, and child endangerment, the police finally left. The house was dead quiet. I spent the next hour sitting on the couch with Emma, holding her until her breathing steadied, and she finally fell asleep against my chest. Once she was safely tucked into her bed, I walked down the hall to assess the damage in my master bedroom. Vanessa had been completely ruthless. My mattress was flipped. Drawers were pulled out and emptied onto the floor. Antique jewelry boxes were smashed open, their contents scattered. It was a desperate, manic search for liquid assets. I grabbed a trash bag and a broom, starting the tedious process of cleaning up their mess. As I swept near the overturned nightstand, a folded piece of thick, high-quality paper caught my eye. It had slipped out of Vanessa's designer handbag during her frantic search. I picked it up and smoothed it out under the light of my bedside lamp. It was a commercial lease agreement for the upscale building where Vanessa ran her high-end fashion boutique. The rent was exorbitant, a clear indication of her extravagant spending habits. But that was not what made my heart stop. I flipped to the last page of the contract. There, right on the line for the financial guarantor, was my name. Someone had perfectly forged my signature, legally binding me to hundreds of thousands of dollars in commercial rent for a sister who had just tried to rob me blind. The harsh fluorescent lights of the local police precinct buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pale glow over the scuffed linoleum floor. I sat in a hard plastic chair by the detective's desk, methodically filling out the final pages of my police report. Emma was safely tucked away in the captain's office just down the hall, wrapped in a fleece blanket and coloring a picture book a kind female officer had given her. My hands were perfectly steady as I detailed the exact value of the antique porcelain Vanessa had smashed. The heavy double doors of the precinct flew open, hitting the wall with a loud bang that made several officers reach for their belts. My mother, Catherine, stormed into the lobby. She was wearing her pristine tennis club attire, her blonde hair sprayed into an immaculate helmet, and her face twisted in a mask of absolute fury. She did not look around for the front desk. She locked eyes directly on me. "How dare you!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the cinderblock walls. She lunged across the waiting area, her hand raised high to strike my face. Before she could even close the distance, a burly desk sergeant stepped out from behind the counter and caught her wrist midair. "Ma'am, you need to step back right now, or you will be joining the people in lockup." The officer warned, his voice low and dangerous. My mother yanked her arm away, adjusting her pearl necklace as if the officer had deeply offended her upper-class sensibilities. She glared at me, her chest heaving with indignation. "Tell them to let your father and sister go this instant, Rachel. This is a family misunderstanding, and you are ruining our reputation over absolute nonsense." I did not stand up. I looked at her with the exact same detachment I used when appraising a worthless piece of faux silver. Breaking my front door, terrorizing my 7-year-old daughter, and destroying my bedroom is not a misunderstanding, Mom. It is a felony. She waved her hand dismissively, completely ignoring the fact that her granddaughter had been traumatized. Vanessa just wanted Grandma's old sapphire necklace. She panicked because she thought you were going to sell it out of spite. You have no right to arrest your own blood over a piece of jewelry that rightfully belongs to her anyway. I let out a dry, humorless laugh. Grandma gave me that necklace before she died, because I was the only one who bothered to visit her in the nursing home. Vanessa did not even show up to the funeral because she was hungover on a beach in Cabo. She did not break into my house for a necklace. She broke in to find cash because her entire life is a fraud. You are just jealous, Catherine spat back, stepping as close to the officer's barrier as she dared. You have always been jealous of your sister. She is building a high-end fashion empire and you are just hoarding old junk. You set them up because you cannot stand seeing her succeed. You are a bitter, miserable woman, Rachel, and if you do not drop these charges, I will make sure you never see a dime of the family inheritance. I do not want your money, I replied coldly. And the district attorney is pressing charges, not me. Richard and Vanessa are being processed for breaking and entering property damage and child endangerment. You cannot scream your way out of this one. The heavy glass doors of the precinct opened again, but this time there was no screaming. Jamal walked in. My brother-in-law was still wearing his tailored charcoal suit from his investment banking firm. He carried a leather briefcase and an aura of absolute authority. Jamal had grown up with nothing and built his wealth through relentless hard work. He despised liars, and he had always treated me with a quiet baseline respect that the rest of my family severely lacked. He surveyed the room, taking in my mother's flushed, angry face, the police officer standing guard, and me sitting calmly with a clipboard. He walked directly over to me, ignoring Catherine's frantic attempts to grab his arm and pull him aside. Rachel, what is going on here? He asked, his deep voice cutting through the tension in the room. The bail bondsman called my office. He said Vanessa and Richard are being processed for burglary and destruction of property. Catherine immediately inserted herself, her voice rising an octave in a desperate attempt at damage control. It is a mistake, Jamal. Rachel is having some sort of mental breakdown and called the police on them for simply stopping by to check on her. You know how unstable she gets. Jamal held up a single hand, silencing my mother instantly. He did not even look at her. He kept his dark, intelligent eyes locked strictly on mine. Vanessa told me she was at a charity luncheon for the Children's Hospital this afternoon, he said slowly, clearly struggling to reconcile the wife he thought he knew with the stark reality of a police precinct. Why is my wife arrested for burglarizing your house? I stood up from the plastic chair. I did not raise my voice, nor did I offer a long emotional explanation. I knew Jamal respected hard facts above all else. Instead of arguing, I reached into my purse and pulled out the thick, high-quality paper I had rescued from the debris on my bedroom floor. I unfolded it and handed it directly to him. Jamal took the document, his brow furrowing as he read the heading. It was the commercial lease agreement for the upscale building where Vanessa ran her boutique. I watched his eyes scan the pages, noting the exorbitant monthly rent and the default clauses. Then his eyes hit the very bottom of the final page. He stared at the line for the financial guarantor, where my name was perfectly forged in blue ink. Vanessa was not at a charity luncheon, I told him, holding his gaze with unwavering certainty. She was tearing my bedroom apart, looking for my bank documents because she is 6 months behind on rent and trying to steal my identity to cover it up. You might want to check your wife's credit score, Jamal. The sharp, aggressive knock on my front door came precisely at 7 in the morning. I had just finished sweeping up the last stray shards of glass from the entryway and was pouring Emma a bowl of cereal. When I opened the door, a woman in a crisp gray suit held up a state badge. Her face was set in a severe, practiced expression. She introduced herself as Ms. Higgins from Child Protective Services. She informed me that she was responding to an urgent anonymous tip filed late last night. The caller claimed I was running a filthy hoarding house, that my home was a hazard zone stacked to the ceiling with hazardous junk, and that my 7-year-old daughter was being severely neglected. I did not panic. I did not raise my voice or act defensive. I knew exactly who the anonymous caller was. Richard and Vanessa had just spent a humiliating night in a holding cell, and this was their immediate vindictive retaliation. They wanted to hit me where it would hurt the most. They wanted to take my daughter. Please come inside, I said, stepping back and gesturing toward the living room. I would love for you to inspect the premises. Ms. Higgins walked in, her pen poised over her clipboard, ready to document the squalor she had been briefed about. Instead, she stopped dead in her tracks. The morning sun was streaming through the bay windows, illuminating gleaming oak floors and spotless cream-colored rugs. High-end museum-quality antique furniture was tastefully arranged around the room. Everything was pristine, organized, and smelling faintly of lemon polish and fresh coffee. She walked into the kitchen looking increasingly confused. Emma was sitting at the marble island in her neatly pressed school uniform, happily eating her cereal and reviewing her spelling words. She looked up and gave the social worker a bright, easy smile. I walked over to the kitchen desk and pulled out a thick, leather-bound binder. I am an estate liquidator and antique appraiser, Ms. Higgins. Sometimes I bring valuable pieces home for temporary evaluation. I imagine my anonymous caller deliberately twisted my profession into an accusation of hoarding. Here is Emma's complete file. I handed her the binder. It contained 3 years of flawless report cards, perfect attendance records, updated vaccination charts, and glowing letters from her pediatrician and dentist. Ms. Higgins flipped through the pages, her severe expression melting into visible frustration. She closed the binder with a heavy sigh. Ms. Wilson, this home is immaculate. Your daughter is clearly thriving. But I have to ask you about the second part of the report. The caller claimed that the child's grandfather had to physically intervene yesterday to rescue her from a dangerous situation in this house, and that you had him wrongfully arrested to cover up your neglect. My blood ran cold, followed instantly by a surge of pure, concentrated fury. Richard had actually tried to spin his violent break-in as a heroic rescue mission. He was trying to use a state agency to punish me for having him arrested. I need you to sit down, Ms. Higgins, I said, pulling out a bar stool for her. I want to show you exactly what kind of rescue mission my father was running yesterday. I opened my laptop on the kitchen counter and logged into my secure cloud storage. My home was equipped with a state-of-the-art high-definition security system, something my father completely forgot about in his arrogant rage. I clicked on the exterior and interior footage from yesterday afternoon and turned the volume all the way up. The video started with the deafening crash of the front door glass shattering. Ms. Higgins flinched at the sudden noise. On the screen, Richard and Vanessa stormed into the house like violent intruders. The camera angle from the dining room clearly showed Emma dropping her crayons and diving under the heavy oak table covering her ears in absolute terror. Then came the audio. Richard's face was purple with rage as he kicked a dining chair out of his way, looming over the table where my daughter hid. Tell me the numbers, Emma. Stop crying and tell me the numbers right now. I know your mother hides her cash in that metal box. Give me the code. The video clearly captured Emma's terrified, breathless sobbing. In the background, Vanessa could be heard throwing my personal belongings against the bedroom walls, shrieking about finding bank papers. It was 20 minutes of unhinged, violent intimidation by 2 adults against a helpless child. Ms. Higgins stared at the screen, her mouth slightly open in horror. The color had completely drained from her face. She watched me walk up to the shattered door, calmly lock the deadbolt, and call the police. When the video ended, the kitchen was dead silent. That is the man who filed the tip against me, I said quietly, closing the laptop. That is the man who claimed he was protecting my child. Ms. Higgins stood up. Her professional detachment was entirely gone, replaced by a fierce, protective anger. People who weaponize this agency to continue their domestic abuse are the lowest kind of cowards, she said, her voice shaking slightly with indignation. Ms. Wilson, I am closing this investigation immediately. This report is entirely unfounded and malicious. She pulled her cell phone from her pocket and dialed a number directly. I work closely with a family court judge for emergency situations just like this. Given the video evidence of a violent home invasion and the subsequent retaliatory harassment through a state agency, you have more than enough grounds for immediate protection. I am requesting an emergency ex parte restraining order against Richard and Vanessa right now. Within 45 minutes, it was done. The judge reviewed the digital file Ms. Higgins submitted and granted a comprehensive order of protection. Richard and Vanessa were legally barred from coming within 500 feet of me, Emma, my home, or my business. Any violation would result in their immediate arrest without bail. Ms. Higgins handed me the official digital copy of the order. Keep this on your phone at all times. Print a copy for Emma's school immediately. If they so much as breathe in your direction, you call the police. I thanked her as she left, feeling a solid wall of legal armor click into place around my life. My father and sister had tried to strip my child away from me, and instead they had handed me the ultimate weapon to keep them completely paralyzed. Just as I locked the front door behind the social worker, my phone buzzed with an automated alert. It was a notification from my commercial property management portal. The mandatory grace period for commercial rent had officially expired at 9 in the morning. Vanessa was now officially in default. I looked at the digital restraining order on my screen, then grabbed my car keys. I had a building to secure. I pulled my car out of the driveway, the digital copy of the restraining order still glowing brightly on my phone screen. The drive to the upscale commercial district took less than 20 minutes, but every second felt like a lifetime of overdue karma finally catching up. This was the most exclusive retail block in the entire city. The sidewalks were lined with manicured oak trees, expensive European cafes, and high-end designer storefronts. It was the exact kind of place Vanessa believed she rightfully belonged. I parked across the street from Vanessa's boutique. Through my windshield, I could already see the chaos unfolding on the pristine sidewalk. Vanessa was pacing furiously in her designer heels, waving her cell phone in the air like a weapon. My mother, Catherine, stood right beside her, aggressively pointing a manicured finger into the chest of a man wearing a heavy canvas work jacket. He was a commercial locksmith. Standing slightly behind him with a calm, stoic expression was Mr. Sterling, the senior property manager I had hired 2 years ago to oversee my commercial real estate portfolio. As I crossed the cobblestone street, my mother's shrill voice cut through the crisp morning air. "You cannot change the locks on my daughter," Catherine shrieked, swatting at the air near the locksmith. "This is a simple banking error. Her husband is a senior investment banker. Do you have any idea who you are dealing with? You are going to be fired before lunch." Vanessa yanked on the heavy brass handle of the boutique door, rattling the thick commercial glass. The door did not budge. The new deadbolt was already securely in place. "Open this door immediately," Vanessa demanded, turning her rage onto Mr. Sterling. "I have VIP clients coming in for a private fitting at noon. You are destroying my brand over a technicality. My husband is wiring the funds to the corporate holding account as we speak." I stepped onto the curb, my low heels clicking sharply against the pavement. "It is not a technicality, Vanessa," I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "It is a default." Both Vanessa and my mother spun around. The moment Vanessa saw me, her panicked expression contorted into a mask of pure, condescending disgust. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed down the quiet street. "What are you doing here, Rachel?" Vanessa sneered, looking me up and down. "Did you seriously follow us just to gloat? Or did you come to dig through the dumpsters out back to find inventory for your little antique business?" My mother stepped forward, her eyes narrowing with absolute contempt. She immediately moved to protect her golden child. "Go home, Rachel. Your sister is dealing with a minor cash flow hiccup, and you show up here in your cheap jeans to stare like a common rubbernecker. You always loved seeing your sister stressed. It is sick. You are a sick, jealous woman." Vanessa crossed her arms, lifting her chin with that signature arrogance she had perfected since childhood. "Do not worry about me, Rachel. Jamal is wiring the rent money directly to the landlord right now. Every single penny. So you can go back to peddling junk from dead people's attics. My business is staying right here." I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked past them and gave a brief, subtle nod to my property manager. Mr. Sterling immediately stepped forward, bypassing Vanessa completely, and bowed his head slightly toward me. "Good morning, Miss Wilson," he said with absolute professional deference. "The locks have been successfully changed and the alarm system codes have been wiped. The premises are fully secured." My mother blinked, looking wildly between Mr. Sterling and me. "Why is he talking to you?" she demanded, her voice dropping an octave in sudden confusion. I reached into my leather tote and pulled out a crisp, heavy stock folder containing the master lease agreement. "I am not a junk peddler, Vanessa," I said, taking a slow step forward to close the distance between us. "I am the owner of this entire commercial block. I bought this building 3 years ago with the liquid capital I made from auctioning a single European estate." Vanessa's jaw literally dropped. The color drained from her face so fast she looked like a ghost. "No," she stammered, shaking her head in frantic denial. "No, the landlord is a corporate holding company." "Yes," I agreed smoothly. A corporate holding company that I wholly own and operate. You do not just have a tiny cash flow hiccup, Vanessa. You have not paid your base rent, your commercial property taxes, or your vendor insurance premiums in 6 consecutive months. The mandatory grace period ended exactly 45 minutes ago. You are officially evicted. That is a lie, my mother shouted, lunging forward to snatch the folder from my hands. I stepped back smoothly, letting Mr. Sterling intercept her. You cannot evict your own sister. I will not allow it. We will sue you for everything you have. You cannot sue me with $0, Mom, I replied coldly. Vanessa's boutique is bankrupt. She owes my holding company over $200,000 in back rent and penalties. Just as that massive financial figure left my mouth, a sleek black Mercedes sedan pulled smoothly against the curb right behind my car. The engine cut off. The heavy car door swung open, and Jamal stepped out onto the pavement. My brother-in-law was wearing a dark tailored suit, but his tie was pulled loose, and his usually calm professional demeanor was entirely gone. Jamal was a self-made man who had clawed his way to the top of the financial sector through brutal hard work and absolute transparency. He despised liars and he despised fraud. His face was a mask of thunderous contained fury. He had clearly heard my last sentence echoing down the quiet street. He slammed the car door shut, the sound ringing out like a gunshot, and marched directly up to the sidewalk. He did not look at me. He did not look at my mother. He locked his furious dark eyes entirely on his trembling wife. Where did the $100,000 I gave you for rent last month go, Vanessa? The silence that followed Jamal's question was absolute. For a fraction of a second, the only sound on the pristine commercial street was the distant hum of city traffic and the rustle of the oak leaves overhead. Then Vanessa exploded. Instead of answering her husband, she threw her hands in the air and unleashed a hysterical, high-pitched scream. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at me, her face completely flushed. She did this, Vanessa shrieked, her voice cracking with manufactured panic. Rachel set me up, Jamal. She purposely bought this building just to ruin me. She has been sabotaging my boutique from the shadows because she is jealous of our marriage and my success. She is trying to destroy my life. My mother instantly rushed forward, wrapping an arm around Vanessa's shoulders in a fierce, protective embrace. She glared at Jamal, nodding vigorously. Listen to your wife, Jamal. Catherine pleaded, her voice thick with fake sympathy. Rachel is vindictive and unwell. She had your father-in-law arrested yesterday over a simple misunderstanding, and now she is harassing your wife. You need to put a stop to this. We are the victims here. Jamal did not flinch. He did not offer Vanessa comfort, and he did not spare a single glance for my mother. A man who had built a massive investment banking firm from the ground up through grit and ruthless transparency, Jamal had a highly tuned radar for deception. He looked at Vanessa's crocodile tears, then at my mother's enabling outrage, and finally he turned to look at me. His eyes swept over my calm posture, the thick master lease file in my hands, and Mr. Sterling standing dutifully at my side. The rage in Jamal's face slowly gave way to a look of sheer, unadulterated respect. You own this building, he stated, his voice a low, steady rumble of disbelief. I nodded once, maintaining direct eye contact. I own this entire block, Jamal. I am an estate liquidator and appraiser. I buy undervalued assets, liquidate them for maximum profit, and reinvest the capital into commercial real estate. I have owned this specific property for 3 years. I watched the realization hit him like a physical blow. For the entire decade he had been part of this family, Catherine, Richard, and Vanessa had relentlessly painted me as a broke, eccentric college dropout who peddled dusty junk from dead people's attics. They had woven a masterful narrative of my failure to elevate their own status. In a single moment, Jamal recognized the absolute magnitude of their lie. I was not the failure. I was the silent landlord they had been desperately trying to steal from. Jamal slowly turned back to his wife. His demeanor shifted from angry to ice cold. Unlock your phone, Vanessa, he commanded. Vanessa froze, the fake sobs dying in her throat. What, Jamal? Why are you doing this to me in public? We can talk about this at home. Please, people are staring. Unlock your phone and open your banking app right now, Jamal repeated, stepping closer, his imposing frame casting a long shadow over her on the sunlit sidewalk. I want to see exactly where the $100,000 I transferred to your account last Tuesday went. You told me it was to cover your quarterly commercial rent and vendor supplies. Rachel just stated you are 6 months in default. Catherine stepped between them, her face pale but her chin held high. Jamal, you will not interrogate my daughter like a common criminal on the street. This is entirely inappropriate. If she does not open that app in the next 5 seconds, Catherine, I will call my legal team and freeze every single joint account, credit card, and trust fund she has access to before you can even hail a cab. Jamal shot back, his voice lethal. Open it, Vanessa. Vanessa's hands shook so violently that she dropped her designer clutch onto the cobblestones. She fumbled with her phone, the facial recognition failing twice before she finally managed to unlock the screen. She opened the banking application, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Jamal did not wait for her to hand it over. He snatched the phone directly from her trembling hands and began to scroll. I stood silently beside Mr. Sterling, watching Jamal's eyes scan the digital ledger. I expected him to find evidence of rampant personal spending, designer bags, luxury vacations, massive spa bills to keep up the illusion of her successful boutique. I expected him to be furious over squandered wealth. Instead, Jamal's eyes widened and then narrowed into dark, dangerous slits. The color completely drained from his face, replaced by a terrifying, silent fury. He flipped the phone around, shoving the bright screen directly into Vanessa's face. It was not a history of shopping sprees. It was a single, massive wire transfer. The transaction had cleared 2 days ago. It was not for $100,000. It was for a staggering $350,000, pulled directly from Jamal's private business reserve account, an account Vanessa only had emergency access to. And the recipient was not a fashion vendor or a property management firm. The recipient listed on the wire transfer was Richard Wilson, LLC. You did not just steal my money to cover up your failing boutique, Jamal said, his voice dropping to a harsh, guttural whisper. You are embezzling my corporate funds to secretly bail out your father's bankrupt business. The immediate fallout from Jamal discovering the embezzled funds was swift and completely merciless. By noon that same day, he had frozen every single bank account Vanessa had access to, changed the access codes on their shared downtown penthouse, and filed an expedited motion for divorce. My sister was left standing on the cobblestone curb with absolutely nothing but the designer clothes on her back and a dead smartphone. I did not stay to watch the rest of her public meltdown. I simply got in my car, drove back to the quiet sanctuary of my own home, and focused on making dinner for Emma. The peace lasted exactly 3 days. On Thursday afternoon, a thick cream-colored envelope arrived at my door via certified mail. It was a formal legal letter drafted by my mother, Catherine. The tone was completely devoid of the shrieking, unhinged hysteria she had displayed at the police precinct. Instead, it was dripping with calculated, venomous legalese. She claimed that my recent actions, specifically having my family arrested and locking Vanessa out of her business, were evidence of extreme mental instability. She stated that if I did not attend a mandatory family dinner that weekend to broker peace, she and Richard would immediately file a lawsuit for grandparents' rights. They intended to petition the family court for partial custody of Emma, arguing that I was deliberately and maliciously alienating them from their only grandchild. A weaker person would have panicked. A court battle over a child is a terrifying prospect designed to force submission. But I knew my parents better than they knew themselves. I knew their financial situation was a precarious house of cards, currently collapsing under Jamal's relentless legal assault. High-powered family lawyers required heavy retainers, and Richard was actively bleeding cash from every direction. The custody threat was a desperate, transparent bluff designed to force me to the bargaining table. Still, cornered animals are the most dangerous. I needed to know exactly what their next move was, and I needed to see all their cards laid bare. I sent a single text message to my mother, confirming my attendance for Saturday evening. I was not going to make peace. I was walking directly into the lion's den purely to gather intelligence. The sprawling family home in the upscale suburbs was suffocatingly silent when I arrived. Catherine had set the heavy mahogany dining table with her best wedding china and crystal wine glasses, attempting to project an illusion of perfect, unbothered domestic wealth. But the cracks in the facade were glaringly obvious to anyone paying attention. Vanessa sat slumped in one of the high-backed velvet chairs. She looked absolutely hollowed out. Her hair was unwashed and she was wearing a simple, unbranded gray sweater. Jamal's absolute financial blackout had aged her a decade in a matter of days. Richard sat at the head of the table nursing a heavy tumbler of scotch. He was trying desperately to maintain his usual aura of arrogant authority, but his hands betrayed a slight continuous tremor. The deep dark circles under his eyes spoke of severe sleepless nights and mounting panic. I took a seat at the opposite end of the long table. I did not unfold the linen napkin. I did not reach for the water glass. I simply rested my hands on my lap and waited in absolute silence. Catherine attempted a strained, overly bright smile. "Rachel, we are so glad you decided to be reasonable." She began pouring herself a generous glass of Chardonnay with an unsteady hand. "Families fight. It is a natural part of life. But at the end of the day, blood is blood. We are ready to put this entire ugly chapter behind us and focus on Emma's future." I stared at her, offering absolutely nothing in return. The silence stretched out, turning the air in the dining room thick and heavy. Richard finally cleared his throat, setting his scotch glass down with a sharp clink against the wood. He slipped his hand into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, legal-sized document. He tossed it carelessly onto the center of the table, making sure it slid right to the edge of my place setting. "Let us get straight to business, Rachel," Richard said, puffing out his chest and slipping right back into the condescending patriarch role he loved so much. "I have drawn up a transfer of deed. You are going to sign the boutique building over to Vanessa, completely free and clear. You will also contact the district attorney first thing Monday morning and officially drop all criminal charges regarding the incident at your house." He leaned forward, steepling his fingers, projecting the false magnanimity of a generous king sparing a peasant. "In exchange, your mother and I will not pursue custody of Emma. We will drop the grandparents' rights petition immediately. Sign the boutique building over to Vanessa and drop the police charges. We'll forgive your disrespect to the family." Vanessa looked up at me, a desperate, greedy light suddenly sparking in her exhausted eyes. She clearly thought this document was her golden ticket back to the affluent life she had just lost. I looked down at the contract resting on the polished wood. I did not reach for it. I did not pick up the silver pen resting beside it. I kept my eyes locked directly on my father. The sheer audacity of his demand was almost impressive, but it was entirely built on a foundation of desperate lies. "You don't want the building for Vanessa," I said. My voice dropped to a calm, lethal register that made my mother physically flinch. "You do not care about her boutique, and you certainly do not care about family unity." Richard's jaw tightened, his face flushing with immediate anger. "I do not have time for your usual defiance, Rachel. Pick up the pen and sign the contract." I slowly leaned forward, resting my forearms on the edge of the mahogany table. "You need the building's equity to pay back the silent investors you defrauded last year," I said, enunciating every single word with absolute clarity. "You need a massive, unencumbered commercial asset to take out a high-yield collateral loan. Because you are drowning, Richard. You need that cash to quietly bail out your failing company before the authorities catch wind of your phantom accounting." The silence in the dining room was immediate and absolute. The color completely drained from Richard's face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified old man. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Beside him, Catherine froze with her wine glass halfway to her lips, her eyes wide with sudden, unadulterated panic. Vanessa just looked confused, entirely unaware of the massive corporate fraud her father had been running behind the scenes. "How do you know about my investors?" Richard finally choked out his voice, barely a raspy, broken whisper. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. I stood up from the table, smoothing the front of my jacket. I looked down at the man who had spent my entire life telling me my career was a useless joke. "Because I appraise estates," I said, allowing a slow, victorious smile to spread across my face. "And I just appraised the estate of your biggest investor who happens to be suing you." The morning sun filtered through the blinds of my home office. I set a fresh mug of black coffee on my desk and opened my laptop. It was 6 a.m. on Sunday, the morning after the disastrous dinner at my parents' house. I expected fallout. I expected angry voicemails from my mother or legal threats from my father. I did not expect an all-out assault on my livelihood. When I logged into my estate liquidation business portal, a glaring red banner flashed across the screen. My flawless 5-star rating had plummeted to a dismal 1.8 overnight. I clicked on the review tab. There were exactly 47 new one-star reviews, all posted between midnight and 4 a.m. The comments were vicious, coordinated, and entirely fabricated. Rachel Wilson is a thief who preys on grieving families, one review read. She appraised my late uncle's estate and pocketed a vintage Rolex before the auction. Another stated, "Do not trust this company. She severely underreported the value of our antique furniture and sold it to her friends for pennies." They went on, accusations of fraud, theft, and exploiting the dead. For a business built entirely on trust, transparency, and reputation, these reviews were a professional death sentence. Any prospective client searching my name would run the other way. A normal person would have panicked. A normal person would have fired off a furious text to their family begging them to stop. I did not panic. I simply took a slow sip of my coffee. Richard and Vanessa were backed into a corner, completely stripped of their power and their money, and they were lashing out like wounded animals. It was sloppy and it was desperate. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Mark. Mark was a cybersecurity consultant. 2 years ago, his father had passed away, leaving behind a massive hoarding-level estate filled with vintage computer hardware. I had meticulously appraised, cataloged, and auctioned the entire collection, securing Mark a profit that paid off his mortgage. He owed me a favor, and he was the best in the business. He answered on the second ring. "Mark, I need an immediate favor," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "I have a targeted harassment campaign hitting my business page. 47 fake reviews in the last 6 hours. I need the origin IP addresses for every single account." Mark did not ask questions. He simply asked for my business URL and told me to give him 20 minutes. I spent those 20 minutes downloading the entire batch of reviews into a secure file. I documented the timestamps, the usernames, and the specific accusations. I cross-referenced the fake names with my client database to prove they had never hired my firm. I built an airtight, irrefutable ledger of defamation. My family wanted to play dirty. They assumed I was an easy target because I had always walked away from their abuse in the past. They failed to realize that stepping away was never about weakness. It was about preserving my energy. Now they had forced my hand. My phone chimed with an incoming secure file transfer from Mark, followed immediately by his call. "You are dealing with complete amateurs," Rachel Mark said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "They did not even bother using a basic VPN to mask their traffic. I traced every single digital footprint." I opened the file on my screen. A detailed map of IP addresses and network registrations filled the page. "Walk me through it," I said. 60% of those reviews were generated from a single commercial network, Mark explained. Someone sat at a desk between midnight and 2 a.m. and churned them out in batches. The network is registered to Wilson Manufacturing and Logistics. It is a corporate subnet. My father, Richard, had literally sat in his executive office in the middle of the night using company resources to defame his own daughter. He was supposed to be figuring out how to save his company from bankruptcy, but his fragile ego demanded he destroy my business first. And the other 40%, I asked, my eyes scanning the lower half of the report. "Those came from a mobile network," Mark replied. "Cell tower triangulation places the device at a luxury high-rise downtown until 3 a.m., and then at an artisanal coffee shop on 4th Avenue right after." Vanessa. The high-rise was the penthouse she was currently fighting Jamal to access, and the coffee shop was the exact spot she went every Sunday morning to complain to her friends. My sister, freshly locked out of her boutique, and her marriage, had spent her morning sipping a $10 latte while writing fake reviews accusing me of stealing dead people's jewelry. "Thank you, Mark," I said, saving the complete report to my desktop. "Send me your invoice. It is on the house, Rachel. Go get them." I hung up the phone. I looked at the undeniable proof of my family's malice. Catherine had threatened my access to my niece. Richard had demanded my building to cover his fraud. Vanessa had tried to ruin my reputation. They expected me to retaliate with emotion. They expected a screaming match. They wanted a fight they could control. I opened a new blank email. I did not address it to my father. I did not address it to my sister. I addressed the email to the 5 senior members of the board of directors at Wilson Manufacturing and Logistics, the very men who held Richard's fate in their hands. In the subject line, I typed "Urgent notification of misconduct by CEO Richard Wilson." I attached Mark's comprehensive IP tracking report, clearly highlighting the use of corporate servers for malicious cyber harassment. Next, I attached the official police report from the locksmith incident at Vanessa's boutique, which detailed Richard's involvement in a public disturbance. Finally, I typed a brief clinical message. To the board of directors, it has come to my attention that your CEO is utilizing company time and corporate network infrastructure to conduct a coordinated illegal defamation campaign against a local business. Please see the attached documentation of this gross misuse of company resources alongside recent police records involving his public conduct. I trust you will handle this internal matter appropriately before I am forced to file a civil lawsuit against Wilson Manufacturing. I did not hesitate. I did not blink. I clicked send. The fallout from my email did not take days to materialize. It took exactly 36 hours. By Tuesday morning, the corporate headquarters of Wilson Manufacturing and Logistics was a hive of suppressed panic. Richard had been summoned to an emergency session by the board of directors. He likely assumed the meeting was a minor nuisance. He was a master of corporate spin, a man who had spent his entire career talking his way out of deficits and shifting blame onto his subordinates. As he rode the private elevator up to the 50th floor, he undoubtedly planned to frame my email as the hysterical, vindictive ramblings of an estranged daughter, jealous of her sister's success. He would apologize for the distraction promised to handle his family matters privately and expect the board to nod and move on. He pushed open the heavy oak doors of the executive boardroom, projecting his usual mask of arrogant, untouchable authority. He wore his best tailored suit, his chin held high, ready to control the narrative. He took 2 steps onto the plush carpet and stopped dead. The 5 senior board members were seated around the massive, polished mahogany table. Their expressions were stony, their postures rigid. But Richard was not looking at them. His eyes were locked on the seat directly to the right of the board chairman, Arthur Vance. I was sitting there wearing a sharp charcoal blazer, casually resting my hands over a thick, leather-bound portfolio. I did not smile. I did not look away. I simply watched my father's carefully constructed reality begin to fracture. Arthur, what is the meaning of this? Richard demanded, his voice cracking slightly before he forced it into a boom of false outrage. Why is my daughter sitting in a closed executive session? Security should have stopped her at the lobby. I want her removed from this building immediately. Arthur Vance, a man who had dedicated 40 years to building the company's reputation, did not flinch. He did not reach for the phone to call security. He simply folded his hands on the table and looked at Richard with absolute disgust. Sit down, Richard, Arthur commanded, his voice carrying the weight of a judge delivering a sentence. Your daughter is not here as a member of your family. She is here under my direct authorization. Richard remained standing, his face flushing a deep, angry red. This is absurd. She sent you a doctored IT report because of a petty family squabble. You are actually entertaining this nonsense. We entertained the IT report long enough to pull the server logs ourselves, Arthur replied coldly. We confirmed that you spent 4 hours on Sunday morning using company networks to launch a cyber harassment campaign. But that is the least of your problems right now. While our internal tech team was verifying the server logs, they flagged several massive unauthorized wire transfers executed from the corporate reserve accounts over the last fiscal year. Richard's hands began to tremble. He grabbed the back of the nearest leather chair, his knuckles turning stark white as he desperately tried to steady himself. Since company funds are missing, Arthur announced, his gaze piercing through Richard, we realized we needed an immediate, discreet evaluation of our physical holdings before we involved the federal authorities. We hired an independent auditor and estate appraiser to value our corporate assets. Meet our expert, Rachel. I opened the leather portfolio in front of me. The crisp rustle of the heavy paper was the only sound in the dead silent room. Good morning, Richard, I said, keeping my tone perfectly clinical and detached. Under the authorization of the board, my team conducted a full after-hours appraisal of the physical assets housed within this building on Monday evening. I extracted a stack of glossy, high-resolution photographs and slid them across the mahogany table. They came to a stop directly in front of my father. Gentlemen, I said, addressing the board while keeping my eyes locked on Richard. Richard has not just been losing money through poor management and unauthorized wire transfers. He has been secretly selling off the company's 19th century corporate art collection. Richard let out a sharp, breathless gasp. The color completely vanished from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. That is a lie. Richard stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for a single sympathetic face and finding none. The Maritime Collection is hanging in the executive suite right now, the original oils. Anyone can walk down the hall and see them. I pulled a small magnifying jeweler's loupe from my pocket and set it gently on the table. Anyone can walk down the hall and see very high-quality Jickley canvas prints, I corrected smoothly. They are excellent reproductions, Richard. The texture mapping almost mimics real brushstrokes, but they are completely worthless fakes. I personally inspected the canvases. The original 19th century oils were removed from their frames, carefully rolled and shipped to a private broker in Geneva 14 months ago. A collective murmur of outrage rippled through the board members. Arthur Vance's face tightened with fury. The Maritime Collection was the crown jewel of the company's physical assets, appraised at over $4 million just a decade prior. Where did the money go? Rachel Arthur asked, though he already knew the answer. The broker liquidated the authentic paintings for roughly $3.2 million, I explained, sliding the corresponding financial tracing documents across the table. The funds were deposited into an offshore shell company. From there, they were systematically funneled into a domestic LLC, registered under a different name. That LLC then made direct monthly deposits into the personal and business accounts of Vanessa Wilson. Richard collapsed into the chair, his chest heaving as he stared blindly at the undeniable proof of his crimes scattered across the table. He had stripped his own company of its most valuable historical assets, defrauded his board, and risked federal prison, all to secretly fund Vanessa's failing luxury boutique and maintain the illusion of her perfect, wealthy lifestyle. You sold the company's legacy to pay your daughter's debts, Arthur stated, his voice vibrating with barely contained rage. Arthur, please. Richard begged, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine. I was going to buy them back. It was a temporary loan. The market took a downturn and Vanessa needed liquid capital. I just needed a little more time. You are out of time, Richard Arthur said, standing up from his chair. The board of directors is moving to suspend you immediately without pay effective this exact second. We are freezing your executive access, your company accounts, and your pension. Our legal team is currently drafting the brief to hand over to the district attorney for embezzlement and corporate fraud. Arthur pressed a button on the intercom console sitting on the table. Security, Arthur said evenly. Please come to the boardroom. We have a terminated employee who needs an escort out of the building. Richard looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute terror and utter disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg to hurl one last insult, but he had absolutely nothing left. He had built his entire life on an illusion of superiority, and in less than 10 minutes I had dismantled it completely with nothing but the truth. The notification pinged on my phone at exactly 8:15 on Tuesday morning. I was sitting at my kitchen island reviewing a new commercial property acquisition when the bright red alert from my primary bank filled the screen. Action required, account frozen. I did not panic. I simply picked up the phone and dialed my private wealth manager. He answered on the first ring, sounding incredibly apologetic and stressed. Rachel, I am so sorry, he said immediately. We received an emergency court order 30 minutes ago. An ex parte injunction. We were legally obligated to freeze all of your personal and business accounts pending a preliminary hearing. On what grounds, I asked, keeping my voice entirely level. The plaintiffs are Richard and Vanessa Wilson, he explained, his voice dropping to a low, uncomfortable register. They filed a civil suit, claiming that the initial liquid capital you used to launch your estate appraisal firm and purchase your commercial properties was embezzled. They are alleging that you stole millions from your late grandmother Eleanor's trust fund, which your father was appointed to manage. I ended the call just as a text message from my mother lit up my screen. Catherine. Give up, Rachel. You have no money to fight us now. Come home, sign the building over to your sister, and beg your father for forgiveness. I stared at the glowing text message, a profound sense of calm washing over me. They were truly backed into a corner, completely stripped of their corporate power and their stolen wealth, and they were lashing out like desperate, starving animals. Richard had lost his company. Vanessa had lost her marriage. My mother was losing her social standing. Instead of reflecting on their own catastrophic mistakes, they decided to launch a bogus legal strike to drain my resources and force my surrender. They assumed that freezing my accounts would paralyze me. They believed their own lie that my success was somehow tied to them. What they failed to understand was that I never relied on their money, and I certainly never relied on their version of reality. I stood up, grabbed my keys, and drove straight to the downtown branch of my bank. Because I was a high net worth client, the bank manager immediately escorted me past the crowded lobby and down into the heavily secured climate controlled vault. The heavy steel door locked behind me with a solid echoing thud, leaving me in absolute silence. I retrieved my key, unlocked my long steel safe deposit box, and pulled it from the wall. I carried it to the private viewing table and opened the lid. Inside, resting on top of a velvet lining, were not stacks of cash or stolen jewelry. There was a thick stack of yellowed original financial ledgers and legally notarized trust documents belonging to my late grandmother Eleanor. Eleanor had been the only person in our family with any genuine business acumen. She had despised my father's arrogant, reckless spending habits. When she grew sick, she knew exactly what Richard would do the moment she passed away. She knew he would drain her accounts to fund his lavish lifestyle and prop up his failing ventures. She had not left me millions of dollars. She had left me something infinitely more powerful. She had left me the original unaltered financial records of her estate, dated and sealed exactly 3 days before her death. The documents explicitly proved that her trust was nearly bankrupt because my father had already been quietly siphoning money from her for years. I had not stolen her money. Richard had. She had given me the ledgers to protect myself from his inevitable blame. I carefully placed the fragile documents into a secure leather folder. As I zipped it shut, my mind began to process the specific logistics of my father's desperate new lawsuit. Emergency injunctions filed over the weekend by top-tier corporate litigation firms required massive, exorbitant retainers. The law firm representing Richard and Vanessa was notorious in the city for destroying opponents through aggressive, expensive legal warfare. They did not work on contingency. They demanded a minimum of $100,000 up front just to file the initial paperwork. Where did that money come from? Richard was entirely suspended from his company. The board of directors had frozen his executive accounts, his pension, and his corporate credit cards. Vanessa was in an identical situation. Jamal had ruthlessly locked her out of their joint banking accounts and canceled every credit card in her name the moment he discovered her embezzlement. Catherine had never worked a day in her life and possessed no independent wealth of her own. They were completely broke. So how did they magically produce a massive legal retainer overnight? I walked out of the bank vault, the leather folder tucked securely under my arm. The crisp morning air hit my face as I stepped onto the busy downtown sidewalk. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I had never initiated a call to before. He answered on the second ring. The background noise sounded like a busy corporate office. Rachel. Jamal said, his voice a low, cautious rumble. To what do I owe the pleasure? I assume this is not a social call. It is not, I replied, my voice steady, cutting straight through the pleasantries. My parents and your wife just filed an emergency injunction against my business. They hired Miller and Hayes, the most expensive litigation firm in the state, to freeze my accounts. Jamal let out a short, humorless breath. I am aware of that firm. They require a massive retainer. Vanessa has absolutely zero access to my money. I made sure of that. I know you did, Jamal. That is exactly why I am calling you. I stopped walking, letting the busy foot traffic part around me on the sidewalk. You need to look at Vanessa's recent loan applications. There was a sharp, sudden silence on the other end of the line. The background noise of Jamal's office seemed to completely vanish. What are you saying, Rachel? Jamal asked, his voice suddenly sharp and incredibly dangerous. I am saying that desperate people do incredibly reckless things. I replied smoothly, gripping the leather folder containing my grandmother's truth. They have no liquid capital. They have zero assets. They did not just freeze my accounts today, Jamal. They forged your signature on a massive high-interest personal loan to pay for their lawyer. Jamal arrived at my front door exactly 40 minutes after I ended our phone call. He did not knock. He rang the doorbell once, and when I opened the door, he stepped inside with the rigid, terrifying posture of a man who had just watched his entire life burn to the ground. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit, his tie perfectly knotted, but his eyes were completely devoid of warmth. This was not the charming, successful man who had tolerated my family's snide remarks at Thanksgiving dinners. This was a man preparing for war. "Show me," he demanded, his voice dropping to a low, authoritative register. He did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. He walked straight into my dining room and stopped at the long oak table. I had already arranged the documents in a precise chronological timeline. I gestured for him to take a seat, but he remained standing, his hands planted firmly on the edge of the wood. "This is the emergency injunction filed against my business this morning by Miller and Hayes," I said, sliding the heavy legal packet toward him. "As you know, their firm requires a minimum retainer of $100,000 for a weekend ex parte filing." Jamal stared at the letterhead, his jaw clenching so tightly I could see the muscle jumping in his cheek. "Now look at this," I continued, sliding a second stack of papers into his line of sight. I ran a deep background trace on the financial routing attached to that law firm's escrow account. The retainer was paid via a direct wire transfer from a secondary lending institution. It was funded by a high-interest short-term personal loan. I flipped to the signature page of the loan agreement. "A loan secured entirely against your personal real estate holdings, Jamal. Approved and processed yesterday afternoon." Jamal picked up the paper. The silence in the room was deafening. I watched his eyes scan the fine print, reading the exorbitant interest rates and the predatory terms that Richard and Vanessa had eagerly agreed to. Then his gaze landed on the bottom line. There, in bold black ink, was his signature. "She forged it." Jamal stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion. It was not a question. It was a horrifying realization. "This is my signature, but the pressure on the loops is wrong. Vanessa has a heavy hand when she writes. She traced this." "She did not just trace it," I added smoothly. "She had it illegally notarized. Look at the stamp. It belongs to David Sterling. He is the in-house corporate notary for my father's manufacturing company. Richard used his last ounce of executive leverage to force a subordinate to stamp a fraudulent loan document." Jamal carefully set the paper back down on the table. He did not yell. He did not throw anything. His reaction was far more chilling. He systematically unbuttoned his suit jacket, took a seat at the table, and leaned back, exhaling a long, slow breath. "Show me the rest," Jamal commanded. I opened the leather portfolio containing my grandmother Eleanor's true financial ledgers. I walked Jamal through every line item. I showed him the dates my father had secretly liquidated the corporate art collection. I showed him the offshore shell companies. I traced the money directly from Richard's fraudulent accounts into Vanessa's failing luxury boutique. Jamal sat in silence, processing the sheer magnitude of the deception. He realized in real time that his wife and his father-in-law were not just toxic, status-obsessed snobs. They were coordinated financial criminals. They had built an entire house of cards on stolen money, and when that structure collapsed, they had targeted his hard-earned assets to save themselves. Jamal reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He placed it squarely in the center of my dining table and pressed the speakerphone button. He dialed his wife. The phone rang 3 times before Vanessa answered. Her voice was breathy, pitched an octave higher than usual to project absolute innocence. "Hi, baby," Vanessa chirped. "I am so glad you called. I have been running around all morning." Jamal looked at me across the table. His expression was made of stone. "Where are you right now, Vanessa?" Jamal asked, his tone perfectly, even betraying nothing. "Oh, I am at the boutique," she lied seamlessly. "It is an absolute nightmare today. We are doing a full inventory check and my staff is driving me crazy. I will probably be stuck here until late tonight." I raised an eyebrow at Jamal. We both knew the boutique was currently padlocked by the commercial landlord, the windows covered in brown paper, the locks changed due to her massive rent default. "That sounds stressful," Jamal replied smoothly. "Have you been moving any money around lately? I got a strange alert from the bank regarding a credit check." Vanessa let out a light, dismissive laugh. "You know how the banking apps are, Jamal. They flag everything. I just paid the standard vendor invoices for the new spring collection. Nothing out of the ordinary. You worry too much." Lie number 2. She was staring down the barrel of a 6-figure fraudulent loan, pretending she had just bought a few racks of designer dresses. "Are you alone?" Jamal asked, his voice dropping slightly. Are you with your father? I tried calling his office, but they said he was unavailable. My dad? No, I have not seen him all weekend. Vanessa insisted, her tone dripping with false sincerity. You know how busy he is with the company. He is probably locked in a boardroom somewhere saving the world. Just as the words left her mouth, a harsh, unmistakable coughing fit echoed in the background of the call. It was a heavy, rattling cough, followed by the distinct sound of ice clinking against a crystal glass. It was Richard. He was sitting right next to her, likely reviewing their fraudulent legal strategy while sipping his midday scotch. Jamal did not confront her. He did not demand an explanation for the coughing. Okay, Vanessa, Jamal said softly. Have a good day at work. Love you, bye. She ended the call with a sickeningly sweet tone. The dining room plunged back into silence. Jamal stared at the dark screen of his phone for a long time. The man had spent years building a legitimate, highly successful career, providing his wife with every luxury she desired, only to realize he was married to a parasite. He slowly looked up from his phone and met my eyes. The cold professionalism had vanished, replaced by an icy, terrifying resolve. I am going to financially ruin her, Jamal stated, his voice a lethal promise. And I want to help you take down Richard. Jamal did exactly what he promised. He did not yell, and he did not make empty threats. He operated with the cold, surgical precision of a man dismantling a bomb. By Wednesday morning, the shockwaves of his wrath had leveled Vanessa's world. He froze his personal credit lines, locked down his assets, and reported the fraudulent loan signature to the bank's fraud division. The ruthless law firm my family had hired, realizing their massive retainer was paid with forged, criminally obtained funds, dropped Richard and Vanessa as clients immediately. My mother, Catherine, realized her husband and golden child were completely out of ammunition. Their corporate power was gone. Their stolen wealth was gone. Their high-priced lawyers were gone. So Catherine decided to load her own weapon. She went after the one thing she thought she could still rip away from me, my 7-year-old daughter, Emma. It was 2:15 in the afternoon. The elementary school dismissal was 45 minutes away. Catherine parked her luxury SUV right in the visitor loading zone, blatantly ignoring the bold red warning signs. She marched into the front office wearing her signature cashmere cardigan and a perfectly practiced expression of profound maternal distress. She approached the front desk, leaning in close to the school secretary, Mrs. Higgins. Catherine played her part flawlessly. She lowered her voice, manufactured a convincing tremble, and claimed she was there for an emergency pickup. She told Mrs. Higgins that I was experiencing a severe psychological breakdown. She spun a tragic, horrific lie that I had lost my business, become a danger to myself, and that Child Protective Services had personally advised her to secure Emma immediately for the child's own safety. Catherine expected immediate compliance. She was entirely used to wielding her polished, affluent persona to bypass rules and manipulate people she deemed beneath her. She assumed her expensive clothes and commanding tone would override standard protocol. But Mrs. Higgins was a veteran school administrator who did not care about cashmere or country club accents. She asked for Catherine's photo identification and calmly typed Emma's name into the district's secure student database. Catherine smiled a tight, triumphant smile, waiting for her granddaughter to be paged and brought to the office. Instead of a green clearance screen, Mrs. Higgins' monitor flashed a blaring, solid red warning. It was the emergency restraining order I had quietly filed and served to my family the morning after Richard's coordinated cyber attack on my business. The legal order explicitly barred Catherine, Richard, and Vanessa from coming within 500 feet of me, my home, or Emma's school. Mrs. Higgins did not blink. She smoothly excused herself, stepped into the principal's private office, and pressed the silent emergency button under the desk. Within seconds, the school's automated lockdown protocol initiated. Heavy magnetic doors slammed shut down the hallways, securing the classrooms. The exterior doors locked with a loud, simultaneous clack, and a direct emergency dispatch was automatically routed to the local police department. My phone rang while I was at my office reviewing Jamal's financial teardown of Vanessa's accounts. It was the school principal. He informed me that the campus was on a modified lockdown, the police were en route, and my mother was currently trapped in the secure vestibule demanding access to my child. I dropped everything and drove to the school in less than 10 minutes. When I pulled into the parking lot, the flashing blue and red lights of 2 police cruisers were already reflecting off the school's brick facade. 3 officers had Catherine cornered near the visitor entrance. She was no longer playing the concerned, weeping grandmother. The cashmere facade had completely evaporated. She was furious, her face flushed a dark, angry red as she yelled at the officers demanding they release her and bring her Emma. I stepped out of my car and walked purposefully across the pavement. The moment Catherine spotted me, her rage boiled over into pure, unfiltered malice. She lunged forward, only to be physically restrained by a broad-shouldered officer who stepped firmly into her path. "You are keeping my granddaughter from me!" Catherine screamed, her voice echoing wildly across the quiet suburban parking lot. "You are unstable, Rachel. You are a thief. You stole my mother's trust fund to buy your pathetic little business, and now you are trying to destroy this family." I stopped a few feet away from her, maintaining a safe, calculated distance. The officers were tight-lipped, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. The lead officer approached me, asking me to confirm my identity and verify the active status of the restraining order. I handed him my driver's license and the stamped legal paperwork I kept in my purse for this exact scenario. "She is a liar!" Catherine shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at my face while struggling against the officer holding her arm. "Arrest her. She embezzled millions from my mother. She is trying to steal my inheritance. She has no right to that money or that child." The lead officer carefully reviewed my paperwork, matched it to my identification, and nodded at his partner. He turned back to Catherine, his expression hardening. He reached behind his back and pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "Catherine Wilson, you are under arrest for violating a court-mandated restraining order and creating a public disturbance on school grounds." Catherine gasped, a sharp, ragged sound as genuine shock finally replaced her blind rage. She thrashed against the officers as they forcefully pulled her arms behind her back, the cold steel clicking shut around her wrists. Her designer purse fell to the concrete, spilling its contents across the pavement. She stared at me wildly as the officers guided her toward the back of the police cruiser, forcing her head down as she was pushed into the back seat. She expected me to look guilty. She expected me to look ashamed of the public spectacle. I walked slowly up to the open door of the cruiser. I leaned down so I was exactly at her eye level. The smell of her expensive perfume mixed with the metallic, sterile scent of the police car. I looked directly into the eyes of the woman who had spent my entire life calling me a disappointment. "I did not steal Grandma's trust, Mom," I said, my voice eerily calm and crystal clear. "I am the executor of it, and you were cut out 10 years ago." I stepped back and let the officer slam the heavy door shut. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruiser disappeared around the corner, casting long, distorted shadows across the elementary school parking lot. I stood on the pavement for a long moment, letting the crisp afternoon air cool the adrenaline still humming in my veins. The school was slowly lifting its lockdown protocol, the heavy magnetic doors clicking open in the distance. My phone vibrated violently against my palm. I looked down at the screen. The caller ID displayed Richard's name. He was calling from his personal cell phone, likely because his corporate line had been permanently disconnected by the Wilson Manufacturing Board of Directors just 24 hours prior. I let it ring 4 times. I wanted him to wait. I swiped to answer and pressed the speaker to my ear, maintaining absolute silence. "Rachel, you need to fix this right now," Richard demanded. His voice was frantic, breathless, and completely stripped of the polished, arrogant corporate cadence he had hidden behind for his entire life. "You need to call the police precinct and drop the restraining order. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them your mother was just confused about the pickup schedule." I leaned against the side of my car, staring at the empty visitor loading zone where Catherine had just thrown her spectacular final tantrum. Catherine violated a court-mandated order and triggered a school-wide emergency lockdown. I replied, my tone flat and entirely unbothered. "The police do not drop felony trespassing and endangerment charges because you ask nicely, Richard. She is going to be processed, fingerprinted, and placed in a holding cell." "Then pay her bail," Richard shouted, the sheer panic causing his voice to crack. I tried calling Jamal. I told him we needed $10,000 in cash immediately to secure a bail bondsman. Do you know what that arrogant bastard told me? He told me he was busy having his locks changed and hung up on my face. He is refusing to release a single cent to us. A cold, satisfying smile spread across my face. Jamal was a man of his absolute word. He had promised to financially ruin Vanessa, and cutting off Catherine's bail money was a flawless strategic first step. Jamal had severed their access to his wealth with surgical precision, leaving Richard and Vanessa completely stranded in the mess they had created. Richard let out a ragged, heavy sigh through the phone receiver. He was desperately trying to compose himself, attempting to salvage whatever leverage he believed he still possessed. "Listen to me, Rachel," Richard said, forcing his voice into a lower, more authoritative register. "We are family. We need to stop this bleeding before it destroys all of us. I am willing to offer you a comprehensive settlement, a plea deal. We can end this war right now today." I did not interrupt him. I wanted to hear exactly how deep his delusion went. "Here are my terms." Richard stated, his confidence falsely inflating. "You will call the district attorney and drop the restraining order against your mother. You will sign the deed of your commercial warehouse over to Vanessa so she has a physical location to rebuild her boutique. In exchange, I will instruct my legal team at Miller and Hayes to drop the emergency injunction. We will cancel the civil lawsuit against your house and your business accounts. I will let you walk away with your estate appraisal firm intact. You cannot afford to fight a prolonged legal battle against a firm of that magnitude, Rachel. Take the deal." I closed my eyes, absorbing the sheer, unadulterated audacity of his proposal. He was broke, suspended, and disgraced, yet he still thought he could dictate the terms of my surrender. I threw my head back and laughed. It was a loud, genuine, unrestrained laugh that echoed sharply across the empty asphalt of the parking lot. "You think this is funny?" Richard snapped, his false composure shattering instantly. "Your accounts are frozen, Rachel. You have no money." "I am laughing, Richard, because you are offering to drop a lawsuit that no longer exists," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, icy whisper. "You do not have a legal team. You do not have an injunction. You do not even have a bank account." The line went dead silent. "Did you honestly believe Jamal would just sit back and let you leverage his assets?" I asked, shaking my head. "Jamal contacted the managing partners at Miller and Hayes directly this morning. He provided their fraud department with absolute, irrefutable proof that the $100,000 retainer you paid them was secured through a fraudulently obtained personal loan featuring his forged signature. Corporate law firms do not represent clients who pay them with stolen money. They dropped you and Vanessa as clients immediately. They voided the injunction, and they reported the fraudulent transaction to the Federal Banking Commission. My accounts were unfrozen hours ago." I could hear Richard's breathing turn shallow and erratic through the speaker. He was suffocating under the weight of his own collapsing empire. "You have absolutely zero leverage," I continued, hammering the final nail into the coffin. "But since we are discussing stolen money, let us talk about grandmother Eleanor." "Leave my mother out of this," Richard choked out. "You thought you covered your tracks when you siphoned her trust accounts 10 years ago," I said smoothly. "You thought shredding the domestic paper trail was enough to hide the millions you funneled into your failing investments. But Eleanor knew exactly what you were. She knew you were a parasite. That is why she named me the sole legal executor of her estate, and she gave me the original unaltered financial ledgers before she died." "You cannot prove anything," Richard wheezed, pure terror bleeding into his words. "Those documents are a decade old. A civil court will throw them out." "I agree," I replied without missing a beat. "Which is exactly why I did not take them to a civil court. I took them to my safe deposit box, scanned every single page, and submitted the complete unredacted file directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service." Richard let out a strangled, guttural sound. "I provided the IRS with a decade of your unreported income, your offshore wire transfers, and the fraudulent tax returns you filed to cover up the embezzlement," I stated, delivering the final fatal blow. "The IRS does not negotiate plea deals with thieves, Richard. They do not care about your corporate title or your social standing. As of 30 minutes ago, every single personal and business account tied to your social security number is officially frozen for federal tax evasion." He tried to speak, but only a dry, broken wheeze came through the phone. "You wanted to freeze my accounts," I said, opening my car door. "Now see how you survive with nothing. Your wife is in a holding cell, your company suspended you, and the federal government is coming for whatever scraps you have left. Do not ever call this number again." I pressed the end call button, sliding the phone into my pocket. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away. The drive back to my office was accompanied by a profound, unbroken silence. For the first time in my life, the suffocating weight of my family's influence was completely gone. I had dismantled their leverage, exposed their financial crimes, and watched my mother get placed into the back of a police cruiser. I assumed they were finally finished. I assumed the freezing of Richard's assets by the Internal Revenue Service and Jamal's ruthless financial lockdown would force their absolute surrender. I severely underestimated the boundless audacity of desperate people. 72 hours after my mother's arrest, my phone rang. It was my attorney Marcus. He did not bother with pleasantries. He informed me that Richard and Vanessa had executed a deeply unhinged legal maneuver. They had bypassed the civil courts entirely and filed an emergency motion in county probate court. They submitted a newly discovered handwritten addendum to grandmother Eleanor's will. According to this miraculous sudden discovery, my grandmother had a sudden change of heart mere days before her death. The document claimed she intended to leave the commercial warehouse, the initial seed money for my estate appraisal firm, and the deed to my personal residence entirely to Vanessa. It was a blatant, entirely fabricated lie. Eleanor despised Vanessa's materialism just as much as she detested Richard's arrogance. She would never have surrendered her assets to them. But the probate court had strict procedural rules. The sudden introduction of a testamentary addendum triggered an automatic mandatory mediation session before a judge would even look at the file. The following morning, I walked into the downtown courthouse. The mediation room was a sterile, windowless box that smelled faintly of industrial carpet cleaner and stale coffee. Vanessa was already seated at the long mahogany table. She looked utterly detached from the reality of her collapsing life. She wore a pristine powder blue designer suit paired with immaculate pearl earrings. It was a glaring, offensive display of stolen wealth. I recognized the suit immediately. It was a recent purchase funded entirely by Jamal's platinum credit card, bought just days before he ruthlessly severed her access to his accounts. She sat with her legs elegantly crossed, a smug, triumphant smirk plastered across her perfectly contoured face. She truly believed this forged piece of paper was her golden ticket back to high society. Richard sat next to her, but he projected an entirely different energy. The pristine, untouchable corporate executive was gone. He looked incredibly haggard. The skin around his eyes was sallow and dark, and his expensive tailored suit hung loosely on his frame. The immediate crushing reality of the federal tax fraud investigation had aged him 10 years in 3 days. He was sweating slightly under the fluorescent lights, his fingers drumming a nervous, erratic rhythm against the edge of the table. He was a cornered rat, completely stripped of his power, banking his entire survival on this one desperate stunt. The court-appointed mediator, a tired man with thick spectacles, cleared his throat and opened the manila folder in front of him. We are here today to discuss a holographic addendum to the estate of Eleanor Wilson. The mediator began reading from his notes. This document was submitted to the court yesterday by Vanessa Wilson. She claims to have discovered it hidden within the lining of an antique vanity desk that previously belonged to the deceased. Vanessa nodded solemnly, placing a hand over her heart in a sickening display of manufactured grief. I was cleaning out the remaining furniture from storage, Vanessa said, pitching her voice into a soft, breathy whisper. I found it tucked into a secret compartment. Grandmother always was so secretive. Reading it broke my heart. She clearly realized her mistake in leaving the estate to Rachel and wanted to make things right. She wanted me to have the properties. She wanted me to be secure. I sat perfectly still, my face a mask of absolute indifference. I did not interrupt her performance. I let her dig the hole as deep as she possibly could. The mediator slid a clear plastic sleeve across the table toward Marcus and me. Inside the sleeve was the document in question. Marcus looked down at the paper, his jaw tightening. As a seasoned attorney, he immediately recognized the implications of a contested will. If this document was admitted into probate, it could tie up my business, my commercial building, and my personal home in litigation for years. It would drain my resources and paralyze my firm. That was exactly what Richard was counting on. He wanted to force a settlement. He wanted me to hand over the assets just to make the legal nightmare stop. I reached out and pulled the plastic sleeve toward me. I studied the document carefully. It was written in blue ink on a piece of standard yellowed stationery. The handwriting was an incredibly admirable attempt at forgery. Someone had clearly spent hours studying Eleanor's looping old-fashioned cursive, mimicking the sharp angles of her capital letters and the heavy slant of her signature. If I did not know any better, I might have believed she actually wrote it. But my grandmother was a meticulous, calculating businesswoman. She would never have scrawled a legally binding transfer of multi-million-dollar real estate assets on a random piece of scrap paper. My eyes scanned the heavy paragraphs detailing the transfer of the commercial building to Vanessa. Then I looked down at the bottom right corner of the page. In their panicked, frantic rush to make the document appear ironclad and legally binding, Richard and Vanessa had made a catastrophic amateur mistake. They had taken the forged paper to a corrupt notary public to have it officially stamped and sealed, assuming the official insignia would intimidate the mediator and legitimize the forgery. I stared at the raised ink of the circular notary stamp. I read the name, I read the certification number, and then I read the date clearly stamped in black ink right beside the signature line. A profound, unshakable sense of victory washed over me. I did not react immediately. I kept my eyes locked on the paper, letting the silence stretch out in the small room. Vanessa shifted in her chair, misinterpreting my silence as defeat. "I know this is hard for you, Rachel," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with venomous, condescending pity. "But we have to respect grandmother's final wishes. She wanted me to have the building. She wanted me to have the house. If you just sign the transfer deeds today, we can avoid a long, ugly court battle. Richard is even willing to drop his civil suit against your accounts. We can just walk away cleanly." I slowly looked up from the document. I looked at Vanessa in her stolen designer suit. I looked at Richard, sweating and trembling with desperation. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply placed the document flat on the table and smiled. The notary stamp on this newly discovered document is beautifully clear. I stated, my voice echoing sharply against the bare walls. It is officially dated and sealed on October 15th. Richard stopped drumming his fingers. Vanessa's smug smile faltered. Grandmother Eleanor passed away on October 12th. I continued, my smile widening into something entirely lethal. You brought a forged will to a mandatory court mediation notarized exactly 3 days after the woman was already dead. Marcus stepped out of the mediation room to field an urgent phone call from the federal investigators handling my father's newly frozen accounts. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, leaving me entirely alone at the long mahogany table with the court-appointed mediator, my sister, and my father. The silence following my revelation about the forged notary stamp was thick and suffocating. The mediator pushed his thick spectacles up the bridge of his nose, staring down at the date stamped in black ink. It was an undeniable physical impossibility. The document was a fraud notarized 3 days after grandmother Eleanor had taken her final breath. Vanessa looked as though she had just swallowed broken glass. The arrogant, triumphant glow vanished from her face, leaving her looking pale and terrified. She shrank back into her expensive blue suit, her eyes darting nervously toward her father, silently pleading with him to fix the catastrophic error they had made. But Richard did not retreat. When a narcissist is backed into a corner completely stripped of logic and leverage, they do not apologize. They attack. Richard's face flushed a deep, violent crimson. The impending reality of his federal tax evasion charges and his total lack of liquid capital pushed him over the edge of rational thought. He slammed both of his fists down onto the mahogany table with such explosive force that the mediator's ceramic coffee cup rattled against its saucer. He completely ignored the indisputable fact that the document was a blatant forgery. He abandoned legal strategy entirely and went straight for brute, unhinged intimidation. "You think a clerical error on a stamp changes anything, Rachel?" Richard snarled, his voice echoing harshly off the bare walls of the small room. "You hid this document. You kept it from the estate lawyers because you knew your grandmother wanted Vanessa to have those properties. You are a thief. I will drag you through probate court for the next 10 years. I will tie up your commercial building, your business accounts, and your personal home in so much litigation that you will be sleeping on the street before we ever reach a judge." He was banking on my exhaustion. He knew I was a single mother. He knew I had spent the last week dodging Catherine's insane public outbursts, coordinating with police and protecting my daughter. He assumed I was running on fumes, emotionally and financially depleted. So I decided to give him exactly what he wanted to see.